You know, watching the massive protests spring up across the entire world right now, well, it reminds me of a little quote I read a while ago. Here's how it went. You can vote your way into communism, but eventually, your grandkids will have to shoot their way out. And indeed, I personally learned the deeper truth behind that quote exactly 3 years ago today, while I was doing on-the-ground reporting in Hong Kong. Back then, my team and I were running around the city every single day and every single night following the freedom protests, which were springing up across the whole island, fighting back against the encroachment of the Chinese Communist Party. And it was during my time covering all those protests in Hong Kong that my love for the freedoms that we take for granted here in America was once again reignited. I realized that the sacrifices that were made throughout history, as well as the lives that were lost by the American patriots to ensure that we are not like Hong Kong, to ensure that we have the right to free speech, that we have the right to the press, that we have the right to peaceably assemble, as well as the right to voice our dissent. And especially, my appreciation for the Second Amendment was reinforced 100-fold, because over there in Hong Kong, I met so many people during the protests who wished to their very core that they had a Second Amendment just like us. Take a listen.
The Second Amendment protects God-given universal human rights. Since it is a universal right, it means that people everywhere, it is a God-given right, so we should all have it.
And indeed, it's not hard to understand why. The protests in Hong Kong were taking place just 40 miles south of communist-controlled mainland China. And without the right to keep and bear arms, there was quite literally no way that the Hong Kongers could win. The communists quite literally had all the guns. Now, of course, the Hong Kong people could win in the court of global public opinion, which I believe they did. They earned the admiration of people across the entire world. But ultimately, and quite sadly, they lost. The national security law was put into place in the year 2020 amidst COVID, with the official line being that it was necessary for public safety and public order. And ever since then, voicing your dissent in the city of Hong Kong is no longer allowed. Almost all of the independent news outlets have been shut down. Singing patriotic songs or anti-government slogans will actually now land you in jail. And all of the thousands of different creative placards, stickers, and signs that we saw throughout the whole city, well, they disappeared overnight, being replaced with simple white sheets of paper that protesters now hold up. A sign, if there ever was a more fitting sign, of the desperation of their struggle. They found themselves in a situation where the best thing that they could do was to hold up a white sheet of blank paper in quiet dissent. Again, this was exactly the moment that I understood on a very deep level the meaning of that quote. You might be able to vote your way into communism, but eventually your grandchildren will have to shoot their way out. And so, it was amidst this backdrop of my experience of being firsthand in Hong Kong 3 years ago that I was shocked to begin to see the images coming out of mainland China today, where massive, just giant anti-lockdown protests are springing up across the entire communist nation, and the chants of people who are wishing to take down the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, are met with roaring applause. And as you're watching this footage, really consider what's at stake for these people. This is not America, where everyone and their dog can protest anything they want all day long. This isn't even Hong Kong, which at least had a veneer of freedom in the past. This is communist-controlled mainland China. This is the China that's ruled by a party that's implemented a social credit system that denies bus tickets and entry into supermarkets to those who are deemed socially undesirable. This is the Communist Party that set up the largest surveillance network on the entire globe with 5 cameras on every street corner, unabashedly monitoring the movement of every single person in the country. This is the Communist Party that openly has concentration camps in the Northwest for millions of Uyghurs. This is the party that has jailed doctors who dare to blow the whistle on COVID. And this is the party that has allowed hospitals to quite literally make billions of dollars ripping the organs out of living Falun Dafa practitioners who were in jail for their beliefs. Protesting against this regime is no simple matter, and so the gravity of the situation cannot be overstated, nor can the courage of the people who are actually protesting themselves. Now, in terms of how this all came to be, the Communist Party of China has been, for the last several months now, implementing their zero COVID policy. Essentially, using draconian methods that the elites in the West could only dream of, the Communist Party has been, quite literally, attempting to have zero COVID cases throughout the whole nation. And if you think that's impossible unless you quite literally lock down people in their own homes, well, you're right. And that's exactly what they did. You can see footage come out of many cities across China showing the police, dressed in those white hospital gowns, barricading people within their apartments locking the doors, sometimes even going so far as to welding the doors shut and then just walking around bringing people food every once in a while. If you've ever wanted to know what living in a communist prison feels like, well, you're looking at it. And if someone were to still test positive for COVID, even in this type of situation, the Communist Party would send in drones to spray the area down so that the undesirables don't spread the virus to others. However, if you happen to be a firefighter, a fire marshal, or anyone with any common sense and you're watching this episode, then you might be asking the very obvious logical question: what happens if there's a fire? Because here in the West, we have signs in every building telling people to not block the stairwell in case of fire so that people can escape. But what if, instead of blocking a stairwell, you quite literally barricade the entire building? Well, what happened is exactly what you'd imagine. On the night of November 24th, which is exactly 1 week ago today, a fire broke out in a neighborhood within the city of Urumqi, which is located in Xinjiang. The official estimate is that the fire killed 10 people and injured about 9 others. However, those are the official numbers from the Communist Party, and the estimates of how many people actually died range well above 40. And the reason why so many people died in this fire is exactly what we've been discussing. The local authorities, they locked people in the building, they hindered firefighting operations, and therefore it resulted in people quite literally burning to death because their apartments were welded shut. That's the negative. The positive of the situation is that the Xinjiang fire ignited the anger of the Chinese people across the whole country. After the fire, not only did people begin to gather outside, both in Xinjiang as well as other cities, to mourn the dead, but the mourning soon turned into protests. Protests not only against China's zero COVID policy, but also it became a protest against the communist regime as a whole. You can see footage coming out of Shanghai, Beijing, as well as other major minor cities across all of China of people bravely coming out onto the streets and shouting anti-government and anti-party slogans, which then naturally enough led to a slew of arrests by the communist police. And so then the protesters in China got creative. They borrowed the method from the Hong Kongers, and they began to hold up simple white sheets of paper to express their silent protest against the regime. And it's this protest, which has now spread throughout all of China, that's become known as the White Paper Revolution. This is quite literally the largest collective struggle against the Chinese Communist Party within China since the student protests broke out back in 1989, which of course culminated sadly in the Tiananmen Square massacre on June 4th. And to be frank with you, having followed what's been happening in China for the past decade or so, well, these types of large-scale demonstrations in major cities across the country was almost unimaginable, not only because of the threat of death from the communist regime, but also since the education system within China indoctrinates people to love the party like they love their parents. And so generally, no matter how bad the party actually is, people tend to, especially young people, they tend to not complain because they've been taught since kindergarten to conflate the concepts of the party with the country. Most people grow up to think that they're quite literally the same thing, that the Communist Party of China is the Chinese nation. And so to watch these protests happening right before our very eyes is unprecedented, to say the least. But there's much more to the story. When you dig deeper into it, there's actually a dark secret inside of China that is more explosive than any global virus could ever be. And that secret is ready to explode and potentially blow up the entire Communist Party. And I'll tell you about it right after I show you this beautiful coin. This right here is an American Walking Liberty 1-ounce gold coin. And typically, I order at least one of these from our sponsor, American Hartford Gold, every single month. The reason I do so is because, as you likely know, the inflation rate in this country is the highest that has been in, the last 40 years now. Everything like the price of food, the price of housing, the price of gas is absolutely going through the roof. And in fact, market experts like the CEO of JP Morgan Chase, he's not only predicting a recession, but he's even using words like unprecedented economic hurricane. And so listen, I absolutely do not give you any financial advice, but I would recommend that you do what I do, which is pick up the phone and call American Hartford Gold. Their super friendly staff can help you diversify your portfolio by either getting physical gold and physical silver delivered directly to your doorstep like I do, or deposited directly into your IRA and your 401k accounts. They make the entire process super simple. And actually, besides me, they have an A+ rating with the Better Business Bureau with quite literally thousands of satisfied clients around the country. And best of all, to our viewers, to the viewers of Facts Matter, they are currently throwing in $2,500 worth of free silver on your first qualifying order. So giving them a call is an absolute no-brainer. So pick up the phone and call 866-242-2352. That's 866-242-2352. Or text Roman to 65532. Their link will also be down in the description box below. And now let's head on back to the studio. Because you see, as unprecedented as it is to watch these protests emerge across the entire nation, something even more shocking happened just yesterday. Amidst these protests, including the ones that were happening in Shanghai, a man by the name of Jiang Zemin was announced to have suddenly died. Now, you might remember, if you happen to be old enough, that Jiang Zemin was the president of China at the same time that Bill Clinton was the president of America during the period of the 1990s. And he was, by almost all metrics, a brutal dictator. That's because not only did he come into power by backing the crackdown at Tiananmen Square, but then also during the late 90s, in order to cement his power and to fill the highest ranks of the Communist Party with his own followers, he single-handedly initiated the persecution of the Falun Gong spiritual practice within China, which at that time had about 100 million people, Chinese people, practicing it, or roughly 13% of the population. And that persecution, it led to the systematic jailing, dehumanizing, rape, torture, forced labor, as well as death for many people. The estimates range from somewhere on the low end of about 5,000 people having died, yeah right, to upwards of several million people. Furthermore, it was Jiang Zemin, through his faction that he installed within the upper echelons of the Chinese Communist Party, that initiated the industrial-scale forced organ harvesting from prisoners of conscience. You see, even though the mainstream media, both in our country and across the entire world, has remained almost completely silent on this issue over the past 20 years now, more and more evidence has continued to mount showing that the Chinese Communist Party's transplant system, their organ transplant system, is completely unethical, and honestly, you can really say that it's evil. What happened was that starting in 1999, when Jiang Zemin was still in power, the number of organ transplants in China, it just took off. China went from having 150 transplant centers in 1999 to having over 714 of them today. They are now second only to the US. But what's beyond belief is where these organs are actually coming from. Because you see, China seems to, quite literally, have an overabundance of organs. They've had hospitals online advertise on their websites that they could guarantee patients organs within a time frame of several weeks, and that they could even schedule the organ transplant in advance, which, if you just think about it logically, doesn't make any sense, because an organ donor is, at least in theory, someone who happens to die randomly, and they happen to be an organ donor, and they happen to be a match to the person looking for an organ. And so to be able to schedule an organ transplantation operation weeks in advance is already extremely suspect. And to put what's happening into perspective, here in the US, the waiting time for a kidney is over 5 years. But in China, over the past decade now, you could get it within a month. And for the hospitals within China, it's been an extremely profitable business, as their websites show that they're charging $30,000 for a cornea, $60,000 for a kidney, and upwards of $150,000 for a human heart. Imagine what one person is worth to them, quite literally hundreds of thousands of dollars. And now, you might think that it just makes sense because China is such a large country, they have over 1.4 billion people, and so they must naturally have a lot of organ donors. But this is where it gets scary. Culturally, most Chinese people just don't believe in organ donation. They believe that they should be buried with their organs intact. And so the organ donations in China have been almost negligible for the past 20 years. In fact, the Beijing Red Cross stated in the year 2011 that over the past 20 years, only 37 people nationwide registered to become organ donors. Think about that. 37 people in all of China. And yet the wait time for an organ has been measured in weeks. Compare that to the US, which has 156 million registered organ donors, and yet it takes 5 years to wait for a kidney. So where are these organs really coming from? In the year 2010, China's Vice Minister of Health, he had to admit, because there was too much pressure mounting, that over 90% of the organs came from executed prisoners. But that also doesn't make any sense, because with transplants, there are so many factors that go into play, including blood type, tissue matching, as well as disease screening. And so doctors usually cite a ratio of 10 to 1. It takes 10 people to find a suitable donor for just one person. According to independent researchers, on the low end of the scale, China conducts somewhere close to 60,000 transplants per year. And so if you do the math, they would have to be executing somewhere on the order of 600,000 prisoners a year to make that demand, which is totally unreasonable. Estimates range that China executes somewhere between 2,000 to 8,000 prisoners a year, which, by the way, is already more than all other countries combined, but it's still a far cry from the 600,000 that they would have to kill in order to meet the demand. So where are these organs really coming from? Well, as I alluded to earlier, independent researchers have concluded that starting with the time of Jiang Zemin being in power, China has been harvesting organs from prisoners of conscience, including Falun Gong practitioners, Tibetans, the Uyghurs in the Xinjiang area, as well as house Christians. Specifically, the Falun Gong practitioners, they are believed to be the main sources of these organs. These are people who are not criminals in any traditional sense of the word. They are quite literally just thought criminals within a communist dictatorship, and due to their spiritual beliefs, they have been systematically persecuted. They've been thrown into jails, into prisons, into labor camps, into brainwashing centers, where many of them have been tortured in an effort to force them to renounce their beliefs. However, amidst all this torture, many of the Falun Gong practitioners who wound up escaping to the West, they reported, while being in prison, also being subjected to things like blood tests, urine tests, physical exams, and ultrasound evaluations of their organs, very likely in order to form a large data bank that the hospitals in China can pull from in order to get organs on demand. In fact, if you look at the timeline of the onset of China's boom in transplantation and the onset of the persecution of Falun Gong practitioners, it almost runs in complete parallel, with both of them having started in the year 1999 under the reign of Jiang Zemin. Plus, there was a great undercover investigation that was conducted a few years ago where you had investigators here in the West. They were calling up different prisons as well as different hospitals, pretending to be people who are looking for organs and asking them specifically whether those places had any of the healthy Falun Gong organs. Take a listen.
喂，你好，你是中山医院对，是的，对哈，肝脏移植中心吗？对，是的，是。我是要咨询一下，等会儿啊，我在一上面，好吧？好。喂。喂，你好，你好，你是医生吗？这个移植手术啊，那可以做的。那要等多久啊？你放1个礼拜左右就可以做了。他有没有这种列这个法轮功的这种提供的就说是很好。这个我们都是这种。
哎，宋主任吗？
啊，您说吧。
哎，然后他那个医生跟他讲，就是说这个肾源挺好的，就是说那个他练功人家练什么功？练法轮功，就是练法轮功身体都比较好嘛，练功的想。你要给他这么一个
这种情况，我们也有这种所谓的叫不是有呼吸或者有心跳的一些问题，我们也会有。这个我们可能大概有。今年到目前为止，可能这样的有10几个这样的肾脏。
你这个东西呢，你怎么确定他是法轮功学员？这一点你了解过吗？
那怎么确定法轮功学员？到时候我们这边头上面有人会给你出现资料，知道吗？
哦，
他会出资料给你，这你放心。
哦，那好，那你
因为我现在给你，人家有资料，我个人简历什么资料都有。
哦，那好，但还有一个问题，
我跟你说吧。我跟你说白了，我这边呢，全部都是，我们这边也是通着关系，上面有上面的人，知道吗？像这些资料都不你说我都拿给你，知道吗？
那好。
And so, the reason that this is also relevant today is because this persecution and the trade in human organs on an industrial scale by the ruling party of China has become exposed more and more internationally, to the point wherein the Communist Party can no longer just hide it anymore. Therefore, here's where things, you can say, get interesting. Because amidst these giant protests that China is currently experiencing, well, Jiang Zemin died. And so here's the big question. Will the current head of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, will he move to pin all the blame for these crimes against humanity on Jiang Zemin in order to try to wash his own hands of them? He can move to say that it was all Jiang Zemin and his cronies who were planted in the top echelons of the Communist Party. They're the ones who were responsible, and that's that. But if Xi Jinping does that, essentially, he'll have to admit to both the Chinese public as well as the entire world that these crimes were indeed happening behind the scenes, which in the current environment of protests, well, they might just push the Chinese public over the edge, which would then naturally enough lead to more brutal crackdowns by the regime. There's already videos of them bringing in tanks into cities. But a brutal crackdown would have them lose ever more public confidence as well as almost all of their global credibility. Their economy would shrivel, economic investment would dry up, and the party might fall anyway. However, on the flip side, if Xi Jinping doesn't pin all the blame on Jiang Zemin now that he's dead, well, then Xi Jinping himself might have to eventually answer for the crimes against humanity that the party has been committing for the past 20 years now. It's an extremely precarious situation right now, with the Communist Party really teetering on their edge, being between a rock and a hard place. And so what all this means is that within China, major seismic changes will be happening over the next year, the same type of seismic changes that saw the Soviet system collapse seemingly overnight. And whether or not the Chinese Communist Party actually collapses, well, it has extremely real-world implications right here in America to you and me. Because while here in the US, most of the public dialogue, most of the public discourse right now is centered around arguing over minutiae, such as whether or not men can legally enter women's bathrooms. But while we're busy discussing that, the Chinese Communist Party has put into place and has been executing a 100-year plan to destroy America. Again, this is something that the legacy media outlets in this country have completely ignored, But here at the Epoch Times, we've been exposing it nonstop over the past 20 years. In fact, we just published a full-length documentary called The Final War, detailing exactly what this 100-year-long plan is, as well as what can be done to counter it. Here's a trailer for that documentary.
The greatest threat facing the United States is the CCP.
The Epoch Times investigation team had studied the CCP for years, but what we uncovered was yielding evidence beyond our imagination.
With Chairman Mao, with the Prime Minister, our talks have been characterized by frankness.
The Clinton administration said, oh, don't worry about it. This will be a poison pill for China.
China's strategic goal is to make sure that the U.S. has 4 enemies, and one of them must be a terrorist group.
We are giving of our life's blood so that the Chinese Communist Party can survive and thrive.
If you'd like to watch that awesome documentary in its entirety, you can do so over on Epoch TV, our great no-censorship video platform. The link to it will be right there at the very top of the description box. I hope you check it out. And then lastly, I would like to ask for your opinion. What do you think is happening inside of China, and what do you think the implications are for us here in America? Of course, the waiting time for an iPhone has increased to several weeks now. That's I guess, a minor thing. But what do you think will happen if the Chinese regime, in fact, cracks down on the protesters? Will we no longer do business with China? And what impact will that have here at home? I'd love to know your thoughts. Please leave them in the comments section below. I'll be reading them later today, as well as tomorrow and over the weekend. And then furthermore, as you're making your way down there to the description box for that documentary link, as well as the comment section, take a brief detour to smash that like button so this video can be shared out to ever more people. And also consider subscribing to this YouTube channel as well, that we can get this type of honest news content delivered directly into your YouTube feed every time we publish it. And then, until next time, I'm your host, Roman from the Epoch Times. Stay informed, and most importantly, stay free.